Hi guys, welcome back to Chess the Matthew. So on this video, we'll tackle about the game between Nijat Abasov versus Anish Giri on the FIDE World Cup 2023. So here, Abasov is white and start with the move of d4, and Giri here was black and start with the defense of knight f6 to defend the center with his knight. And their opening battlefield on this game goes with the Queens Gambit Declined with the Neo-Orthodox Accelerated variation after bishop g5 on move 5 with h6. So here Abasov plays with the second move with c4 and Giri plays e6, and after knight f3, d5, knight c3, bishop e7 and bishop g5, and here Anish Giri plays the h6 to put a question for this bishop, and Abasov here put his bishop into a safe square via h4 after playing bishop h4, and Anish Giri here grabbed now the pawn on c4, winning a material on the board, but Abasov here tries to regain it back with e3, opening up some lines for his bishop, and after c5, trying to have some queen exchanges on the board if the white here grab that c5 because the d file will be open, and Giri here can immediately have a queen swap on the board, but Abasov here is not interested for that variation, but instead to play the move bishop takes to c4, winning back his pawn deficit, and Anish here transformed the center into an isolated queen's pawn after c takes d4, and Abasov here plays with e takes to d4. So here after e takes to d4, we shall see on this position now that the center now is actually isolated queenside pawn. And here after e takes to d4, Anish Giri here put now his king into safety after kingside castling, and Abasov here do the same with kingside castling. So here after kingside castling, Abasov, Giri now plays knight c6, trying to develop his pieces and trying to put some pressure on this isolated pawn, but we shall see on this position now that this pawn was actually defended twice versus the two attackers, so in exchanges to this pawn on d4 doesn't really hurt the position for the white. So here Abasov put his rook into an open file. Anish here tries to have some dark square exchanges after knight h5, opening up some lines for the bishop by playing knight h5. So Abasov here grabbed that opportunity to have some bishop exchanges because this bishop was actually been moved twice on the board versus the bishop of the black was actually moved once, and after some exchanges on the bishop, it actually saves time for Abasov's perspective. So Giri here grabbed the bishop with knight takes to e5, and Abasov put his knight to a dominant square on the e5 square, trying to control a lot of vital square on the black's camp, and again opening up some lines, having an attack to this undefended knight on h5. So Giri here retreat his knight to a safe square, and after a4, having some queenside expansion on the board, rather than to choose to play his queen first before playing a4, for example after queen to e2, and try to connect his rooks for the white. But Anish here simply play a6 to stop any hop to the b5 square with this knight and bishop. And again, Abasov here can play queen to d2, trying to connect his rooks on the board, but he doesn't care about connection of his rook, but instead to play h4 to have some kingside expansion on the board, because for example after h4, it controls now the g5, and later on if it can be pushed to h5, again it controls the g6, and having a lot of pressure to the king side of black. So Giri here tries to develop a piece via bishop d7, hoping that, for example, if the white here grab that knight, then the black here can actually timely connect his rooks after the exchanges on the d7. But Abasov here was very consistent to his plan for having a kingside assault via another pawn push to g4 with an intention to play g4 or even h5 to have some greater space on the king side that can be useful later on if the white here tries to start now a kingside assault on the board. But Giri here doesn't really care about the expansion, but instead trying to put his pieces into a dominant square after knight c6 that actually controls the center, and with intention to eliminate this powerful knight on e5. But Abasov here was very consistent again to his plan, for example after g5, trying to crack down the defense to the king side, for example after this g5 that attacks both the pawn on h6 or even to the knight to f6, trying to open the g file, for example, so that the white here can start again a kingside attack on the board with his heavy pieces, just like from his previous game against Caruana that he actually show how he can easily demolish the king side of black via having these pieces or even to open the g file on the board. So Giri here plays h takes g5, chooses to open the h file rather than the g file because after h takes g5 we shall see on this position now that the h file was actually opened rather than the g file. For example, if the knight here will retreat and there is g takes to h6, but after h takes g5, instead of putting his knight f6 to a safe square, for example knight h7 or even to knight e8 or even knight d5, Anish Giri here chooses to counter the position via eliminating the strong knight on e5 with knight takes e5, and after rook takes to e5, it is now the time for Giri to save his knight to h7 square, and again having two attackers to this pawn with only one defender. Abasov here reinforced some defense, and after rook c8 attacking this undefended bishop, but Abasov here retreat bishop to d3 with an intention to have a threat to checkmate the black here in 1, but Giri here defend with f5, blocking that idea of mating threat to h7. So Abasov here grab now the pawn with passant after g takes f6, and after knight f6 attacking the queen retreats, king f7 vacating this square for the rook to be played on this rook h2 h8 to control now the open h file. So rook e to e1, the white here doubled now a piece on the open e file, pressurizing this e6, but Giri here tries to counter now on the board with rook h8 attacking the queen g5 and rook h6 with an intention to vacate the square so that later on the black here can reinforce the troops to queen to h8, trying to pressure now the h file on the board. But Abasov here again is very aggressive and he plays rook 1 to e3 with an intention to play maybe rook g3 to pressure now the g7 pawn with only one defender. But Giri here plays bishop to c6 with an intention to give a checkmate in 1 against the white king, but Abasov here defend and avoid the checkmate by playing king to f1, for example having a lob square to the a2 square. And here Anish Giri commits a bad move after playing knight to d5, attacking this rook and the knight, and after knight to d5 it actually opened up some lines for the black's queen, hoping for a queen trade on the board. But Abasov here just played the move rook to g3 so that, for example, any capture to this queen will just lead to a pressure to the g7 pawn because the white here can recapture with the rook and having two attackers to this pawn with only one defender. So after king f1 and knight d5, Giri here should not play knight d5 on move 27, but instead, for example, after king f1, play a capture on d4, because after rook takes to e6, trying to equalize the material, but there is simple king to g3. The idea here is to stop a timely check on e7, and again with a threat of this queen and rook eyeing to take the g7 and mate the black king here. And then, for example, if the white here plays rook to e7, going for that idea, but there is simple knight g4 here for black with a threat to grab now this rook with this knight on g4. And again, for example, if this rook will be moved, then there is a checkmate threat on the f2, and again a timely defense to the g pawn because it opened up some lines for the queen on d4. So after, for example, rook to e2, defending the checkmate threat of the knight and queen to this pawn, but it doesn't really help the position because there is another checkmate ideas with rook h1 checkmate. So going back, for example, after this position, after Abasov here plays king f1 and Giri here play a bad move with knight to d5, hoping for some queen trade. But Abasov here is not afraid for the queen trade because he just played the move queen g3, and after, for example, queen takes g5, rook e takes g5, and again there is now a pressure to the d7. So the black here defend with rook g8, but again there is bishop g6 check, and after king f6, bishop to e4 with an intention to win a pawn on the e5, for example, after the capture of this knight and recapture with the bishop, and after the knight takes and pawn takes, and then there is rook takes to d5, winning a pawn. So the black here retreat his knight to e7, and after bishop takes c6, knight takes c6, knight e4 with a check, king f7, rook f3 check, king e7, rook b3, but Giri here finds a way to equalize the position again with b5, because after rook c3 there is a simple counter move of rook to h4, attacking also the knight of white. So if Abasov here capture this knight, then Giri here can also recapture the knight on e4, and again to equalize the position. So after e takes b5, f3, defending his knight. So here Anish Giri grab now the pawn on d4 and having an extra material on the board. But after rook c7, Anish Giri here actually blundered a move after playing his king to f8, because there is a simple knight d6 with a threat to checkmate in 1 for Abasov. Going back, for example, after rook c7 check, Anish Giri here should retreat his king to d8 rather than, for example, to king f8, because after, for example, king to d8 and rook g to c5 with a threat to win the rook on e8, but there is simple rook e8, regrouping his piece so that everything was actually been connected and avoid any loose piece on the board. Although after rook to e8, this g7 pawn was actually totally undefended, but after rook takes g7, the position was actually a radical equal. After, the black here should play an accurate defense by playing rook to e7, rather than, for example, grabbing this pawn, because after knight takes f3, there is a simple move of knight to f6, attacking this rook and with a threat of checkmate in 1 to e7. And after rook to e7, Abasov here has nothing left on his sleeves, because the dust was very clear and the position was actually leads to a radical equality after rook g8, rook e8, rook g7, rook e7, and rook g8 with a triple refutation on the board. So after rook c7, Giri here commits a blunder move by playing king f8 and allowed Abasov here to have a winning strike after knight d6, threatening to mate in 1. Even though Anish Giri here tries to save the position with rook f4, but there's simple rook g4 for Abasov, trying to deflect this rook, so that, for example, if this rook capture the rook on g4, then there is mate in 1. So Anish Giri here maintain a control on the f file, but after rook takes f3, but there is a simple king to g2, and again escaping to the check and attacking this rook on his position. And while this rook was actually again attacking the knight on d4, and if this knight will be moved, then this rook on f3 has no defense to be left. And again, after 42 moves, Anish Giri here resign and Abasov wins. So that's all. I hope you enjoyed this video, and please don't forget to subscribe.